Well, I moved to Orworth in 1970. We moved on to Chaseview Road with my family, and I only went to the village school for about 6 weeks before going on to senior school, so I didn't really have the opportunity to make too many friends at that time. And because I went to school in Lichfield to the Friary, again, the majority of the people went to John Taylor School, so again, I didn't sort of have a chance to make that many friends. But one person I did meet sort of at the bus stop in Fox Lane was somebody called Claire Hudson, who used to live on Fox Lane herself. And she used to go to school in Lichfield, and we became sort of quite good friends travelling on the school bus. And I used to spend a lot of time with Claire around at her house, sort of playing music. We liked the Jackson 5, the Osmonds, David Bowie, played all those sorts of records, and used to have lots of fun around there, and all the people came round, so I got to know more people. One being Paul Edwards, affectionately known as Tat, who we used to play Postman's Knock with, who he likes to remind me of every time he sees me. So we had a good time sort of listening to all the music, and I can remember quite clearly as well going to her house to watch Princess Anne's wedding, because they had a colour TV, and I'm not sure that we did at that time. So I had lots of fun with Claire. And travelling on the school bus was always an experience, because I went to the Friary and they had a very strict uniform code, and we had to wear red berets. And all the lads on the bus used to pinch our hats and have great fun sort of throwing them around the bus. We were always the butt of everyone's jokes with our red berets. So that was really good. Leisure time, besides sort of going around to Claire's house, I spent a lot of time sort of playing over at Walkfield. And in those days there were some big concrete pipes over there, which I presume were left from when the Watford estate was built. And we used to spend ages playing in there, running in and out of them, hiding. And there was a lot of earth as well, which had been mounded up, and grass had grown over it over a period of time. Lots and lots of molehills on there. So we used to dig for all the moles. Not that we ever found any, but we used to sort of take our spades over and try digging for these moles. And of course the canal was always the source of our leisure time, and the level of the canal was a lot lower in those days, and by Lock Cottages there were some rocks that were sort of exposed out of the water, and we used to stand on there and play on there. And also in a few areas where the bends in the canal were, it was quite sort of sandy, so we used to pretend that it was the seaside and we were on the beach and have lots of fun there. And it seemed a lot cleaner in those days as well, so we did used to paddle and swim across the canal. And while I was over there, I met Brenda Greenleaf, who used to be over there sort of fishing a lot. And I borrowed my brother's fishing rod, and she did teach me how to fish, so I did used to do a little bit of fishing from time to time as well. By that time I'd met a girl called Melinda, who lived on Walkfield Road, Melinda Pullen, and we became sort of quite friendly. And she was a member of the Scout band, and my brother then, Brian, he joined the Cubs, and then he also joined the Scout band, so I used to go down to the Scout hut with them, and the Scout hut sort of really became the focus of my life, really. The band used to play in competitions quite regularly, and I'd go along with my family. We went to places like Poole in Dorset and Bellevue, Manchester, and we sort of watched them in all the competitions. And then as time went on and I got a little bit older, the boys became more of an interest to me who were in the band. Quite a few fit blokes at that point or so, I thought. And so I sort of got quite involved in the social side of being down at the Scout hut. We used to have a sort of youth club night on a Saturday, and we'd go down there and play records. They had a full-size snooker table there, which I believe is now in the British Legion. It's a proper snooker table. And then there was a smaller table, which I think might have been Bagatelle, and we had table tennis table. There was a dartboard up there. We used to have lots of fun on a Saturday night going down there, all getting together, and then sort of end of the night we'd nip round the Willy for the last pint. So we had lots of fun there. One of the things we sort of getting involved with them as well, and sort of being quite fond of the boys at that time, I used to go down to the Venture Scouts, and my friends at school, none of who sort of lived in Orworth, they were from Shenstone, Muckley Corner, Yoxall, all around. They were quite intrigued that I'd suddenly found this sort of source of boys. So they used to come over, and we used to go down to the Scout hut, both to the youth club there and also to try and get involved with the Venture Scouts. But Ron Chapman, who was the Group Scout leader at the time, he was having none of it. No way was he going to have girls in his Scout group. So it's a bit of rebellion, really. We set up a Ranger Guide unit, and Sally Thomas, who was later to become a sister-in-law, we sort of persuaded her to lead it for us because she'd had sort of previous guiding experience. I don't know if it actually lasted for very long, to be honest. It was just our excuse to get with the boys, really. But we did do some fundraising sort of as a group. I can remember we went over to Burton Hospital one Christmas, and my dad dressed up as Father Christmas, and we took lots of gifts for the children. I don't remember an awful lot really about the Ranger Guides other than that, except that the Scouts one summer, they did a camp down at Witchner, and we were desperate to go with the boys camping. And we thought, well, if we went as Ranger Guides and camped on the opposite side of the river, there wasn't really anything that Ron or anybody could do about it. None of us had got any experience of camping whatsoever. So the lads sort of rallied round and got us some equipment. I can remember Ian Arnold, better known as Noddy in those days, he lent us a tent, and we acquired all of these pots and pans and bits and pieces that we needed, and we set off for this camp. And we camped opposite where the boys were, and there was some cows on the far side of the field, but we didn't pay too much attention to them. The lads helped us set up the tents, and everything was fine. And that evening they were going to have a big campfire, but the older lads decided it wasn't really their scene. They were going to go into Barton for some drinks, so we went with them. And Dave Arnold at the time had got an old Ford Anglia, and I've always thought the number 13, I'm sure there were 13 of us that crammed into this Ford Anglia, and we went into Barton to the pubs. And when we got back after the pubs had shut, we could see a lot of torchlight and activity around our tents, and not sure really what was going on. But as we got closer, we could see all the Scout leaders, and what had happened was these cows, who we didn't think were going to be any bother to us, had gone over to investigate. They'd trampled the tents, dented all the pans, eaten the food. Everything was absolutely trashed. My one friend hadn't got a waterproof, and she'd borrowed her mother's cream raincoat, and I can remember finding the sleeve of this raincoat on the ground covered in cow muck. And Ron Chapman and Trevor Noble went absolutely ballistic at us, furious. So they shoved us all in the Scout van, dumped us back in the village at some unearthly hour of the night, and told us we'd got to be down the Scout hut early hours the next morning, and they were going to bring all of the equipment back, and we'd got to clean it. I was absolutely terrified because my dad was like really strict. I was quite scared of my dad, and he wasn't home by the time we got home. He was out with my mum somewhere, and all of these girls were my school friends who didn't live in Orewa, so they couldn't get home. So we'd got them dotted all over the village. There was one who slept in a caravan on the end of Martin Holden's Drive in Fox Lane. One girl slept at my house, and they were just everywhere. And the following morning we had to go with our tails between our legs down to the Scout hut and clean up all the mess. And we've never lived it down to this day. That was my very first sort of camping experience. I did a paper round when I was old enough, probably about 12 or 13. My round used to be along Main Street, and at that time I was working for Ben Paul, Robert's dad, and that was based at the old shop down at the bottom of Kent's Bridge on Main Street. So it's quite a big round that I used to do along Main Street, quite a lot of houses. I always had my bag full of really heavy newspapers. They all seemed to read the Times and the Observer and all the big newspapers that weighed a lot. But at the top of Main Street, next sort of near the old Barker's shop, there was a builder's yard there, and there used to be a guard dog on patrol. It was a big white Alsatian, but every time there was the slightest bit of a breeze, the gate would fall down and the dog would get loose. And I was absolutely terrified of going past this dog. It had me pinned in a garden opposite once, and I was really scared of this dog. And I used to have to go back to the newsagents with half my round not done. And Ben Paul was never too pleased with me, but I was always too scared to go past it and finish my round. As I got a bit older, I then sort of did another job for the newsagents, and that was sort of to go around the village and collect all the newspaper money from the locals. and I believe that I took over the round from one of the Lathbury boys, and I used to do it with Viv Nunes. We used to sort of go knocking on the doors and collecting the money. But one of my favourite roads was in Wellfield Road, where a lot of the elderly customers there, they'd sort of hide all the money for us and let us know where it was, so we could sort of just go and pick the money up, or they'd offer, invite us into the house, and used to like having a chat. And it always used to take me sort of twice as long as it should have done to collect the money, because I was always chatting to people along the way. But that was sort of some of my first employment in the village, apart from doing a lot of babysitting, which I used to do for my neighbours. And then sort of later in my teens, I did a part-time job at Tesco's, and then worked in the village pubs. And one of the pubs, which, although it's not in Orrowis, it was built by an Orrowis man, Dennis Woodings. He lived in Park Road, I believe, at the time, and he was a builder. And he built the last Bull's Head that there was on the A38 at Fradley. And Tim, who was my husband at the time, he would always fancied working in a pub and asked Dennis for a job. And I used to go along there with him, and eventually ended up working there myself. And again, we had some sort of really funny times up there, one of which was they had a pet cow called Daisy. And whenever the landlord and landlady went on holiday, Tim and I used to look after the pub for them, along with Barry Keane. And one Sunday evening, I think it was, we'd run out of change at the pub, so Tim and I walked up to Fradley Arms to get some money. And when we came back, we saw a Porsche on the car park, which was quite sort of crunched up, and we were sniggering to ourselves, thinking, oh, bet he's been speeding, serves him right, posh car and all this. But when we got into the pub, there was a very irate man there, and what had to happen was that the cow, who we believe was in season, had tried to make a dash for it across the A38 to the field of bullocks that were opposite, and this Porsche had crashed into the cow, causing more damage to the car than it had done to poor old Daisy. So we had to deal with this very sort of irate man. But Barry, bless him, he'd sort of rescued the cow, and he'd taken it into the kitchen at the pub, and the cow was there sort of having its wounds dressed and bathed by Barry in the kitchen of the pub. So, that was quite a funny tale, something that we always remember. But there were always things going on up there that sort of did make us laugh, and there was a disaster every time we seemed to look after the place. I also worked at the William IV for 16 years, and again, really good times down there. They used to have fancy dress parties every sort of New Year's Eve, and some of the costumes that people wore sort of were hilarious, and we used to have custard pie fights, and it was a really good place to work, good atmosphere, and really fun times. In 1997, following the death of my in-laws, Tim and I moved to Mill End Lane, where he'd grown up as a child. We were really pleased to have gone there. There was a lot of family history involved, because Tim was actually born in Cobweb Cottage next door at number 25, where the family lived with the grandparents and the uncles. And then when I think the house belonged to the great uncle, Albert, and when he died, he'd always said that the house would then be left to Tim's mum, Edna Thomas. But unfortunately, no will could be found, and the house had to be sold. And at that point, it was sold to Delise and Roger, who still live there. And Tim's family moved next door with the granny to number 23 Mill End Lane. And when number 21 became empty, Tim's father bought that from one of Mr. Weaver, who owned the cottages at the time, and he knocked the two cottages into one, and that's where they lived. So it was like sort of going home really for Tim, and we were really pleased to have that cottage in such a lovely spot. And Tim's father, he actually built the island outside the house. George Thomas, who is affectionately known as Mick, was a real sort of village character. But him and the gentleman that lived next door in Elm Tree House, who I believe was Mr. Winterton, they decided that they wanted to develop just this little patch of earth that was there at the time. So they approached the council and got permission, and I believe that the council provided all the sandstone blocks that are around there now, and they developed the island. And Tim's dad sort of looked after it for years and planted all the plants around there, grown them himself, and it always was sort of a focal centre for the village. So I felt that I'd got a lot to live up to once we moved there, and I wasn't really a gardener at that point, had no interest in it whatsoever. But I tried to keep the island tidy, and because there was a greenhouse in the garden, I had a go at growing plants myself and became hooked. And so during the time that we lived there, I also sort of looked after the island for his dad, really. But it was always a real sort of social thing to be doing the island, because every time I was out there, somebody would come past and have a chat. It always used to take me ages and ages to do it, but I used to really enjoy meeting people and talking sort of while I was out there gardening, which was really nice. They were, but I believe the allotments that when I can't remember whether it's when. No, I think the allotments were there, and I think that Delise and Roger owned them certainly at that time. But before they owned them, they were owned by Mr. Orme, who used to have the mill. Mr. Orme lives in Post Office Road. I believe that they were owned by him at that time. But there have always been allotments there. One of the other leisure activities that I became involved in was being part of the CB Radio Club. And we used to meet sort of over at the cricket club in Oriwas, a big crowd of us, and we sort of got quite a fraternity really of all these CB radio fanatics with all of their silly names. I think I was known as Childminder at the time. And it was a real good sort of social event. And one of the people who did come along was actually Ben, who was the local policeman at the time. But of course at that point CB radios sort of weren't legal, but we felt that we were okay as soon as Ben came along, so that was okay. And Paul, who used to be the milkman, he was a very good artist, and he made us all badges with sort of pictures on relevant to our CB names, or handles as they were known. And we used to have sort of quite a lot of fun over at the cricket club and doing discos and just sort of getting together and chatting, a good social network. And then back in 1988, myself and Nancy True, we organised a Scout Band reunion, because by that time I was then married to Tim, who'd since left the band, and lots of people had sort of wandered away doing their careers and moving away from the area. But we organised a band reunion, and I think it was to commemorate Ron Chapman's, one of his special birthdays, 60th or 65th I believe. And it was lovely to catch up with people who'd also come back for this reunion. And going on from there then, Tim became involved again, sort of supporting some of the younger ones, teaching them to play bugle, and sort of going out on parade with the band again. And by the time our children came along, as they got older, they were also sort of joining the band, because I was still a groupie at that stage, despite my age, still used to like to go down there. And eventually my son joined playing the bugle like his dad, and my daughter Katie, she joined initially playing the cymbals and then went on to play the glockenspiel. And we used to travel all over the place and do displays. And I was still very jealous, still desperate to be in the band. But then I became a Beaver Scout leader when my son Lee was 6. And that gave me the opportunity to nudge my way in. So eventually, well into my 30s, I did join the Scout band and sort of fulfil my dream of being part of that, and thoroughly enjoyed my time with them up until, unfortunately, the band disbanded. Because people, I think, sort of had so many other interests, weren't able to commit to the time to being the band anymore, and so it was a shame that it disbanded. I played the tenor drum. It was about as good as it was going to get, because I've got no musical talent whatsoever, and just keeping a rhythm on the tenor drum, that was a challenge for me. And there was one particular piece of music that had where I had to sort of do a little twiddly bit in the middle, and so rather than the bump 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 rhythm that I was used to, I had to do this extra bit. But unfortunately my feet always wanted to do what my hands were doing, and it wasn't good when you were out on parade. One of the other things that we did sort of being involved with the Scouts was that one of the Scout leaders, Richard Butcher, he won a bicycle in a newspaper competition. And on a Thursday night after Scouts, we'd all sort of get together and meet at Claymore. And Richard and my husband Tim had had a few drinks one night, and Richard had won this bike, and he suggested that they go and do a bike ride. So Tim agreed, and they talked about it and a few more drinks, and they decided not just any old bike ride, but they were going to cycle from John O'Groats to Land's End. So that's what they did. We sort of spent about a year planning it, and the boys, they sort of did a route, and we contacted scout groups along the way to ask if we could stay in their scout premises overnight to cut down on costs. And Tim and Richard did the bike ride. James Walker did part of the ride with them, but he was only able to commit a few days. And then myself and Jill Dyer went along with them as the support group, drafted my mum in to babysit the children while we were away, and we did this sort of wonderful this bike ride starting off in John O'Groats. But the boys had only cycled 2 or 3 miles on the first day, and Richard injured himself, and he was being a bit of a wuss, said he couldn't go on any further, but sort of gathered himself and got focused and set off again. And then we'd borrowed a minibus as the support vehicle from Stuart Blincoe, who lived on Main Street, and his son was in the Scouts. And we'd not gone very far, and James Walker, I think, was driving the van at the time, and he was having trouble with the clutch, and lo and behold, the clutch went in the middle of nowhere, not far out of John O'Groats, not a building or anything to be seen for miles and miles. So we were a bit stuck, wondering what on earth we were going to do. And it was just like a film scene, because out of the blue came this AA van, which we flagged down. And the driver wasn't able to sort of tow us in or anything, because he'd got another vehicle on the back. But he did show James how to drive the vehicle without using the clutch. So we limped to Inverness, and we had to sort of spend a day there while we had the van repaired. So it's a good start. But they did raise a lot of money. I think it was about £2,000, which was shared between the Scout group and the air ambulance. And they built the extension at the Scout hut with some of the money that they'd raised. And Tim Latham was the group Scout leader at the time, and he sort of kept tabs on us back in all of us, kept in touch with us. And we had a big map with our route on it, which we placed in the chip shop. So Tim used to go down every day and plot on this map where the boys had got to on the bike ride. So that was a real good experience, really good. And then also sort of being in the Scouts, being a Beaver Scout leader, the parent of 2 of the boys that we'd got, Andy Gillett, he was a pilot, flying helicopters. So we arranged for him to bring a helicopter to Beavers one night, had permission from one of the Malibas to land the helicopter in the field, and it was a great experience for the kids just to see the helicopter coming in to land, and then to be able to sort of climb on it and have a look around it. And of course Andy also then brought the helicopter to the school on quite a few occasions, so the children got to see it sort of a lot more often. And if ever we saw a low-flying helicopter at the time, everybody was always looking to see if it was Andy. It's a nice experience for them all. When my children were little, Lee was born in 1985, Katie in 1983. They went to the nursery school at the Methodist Hall, and there was also the playgroup, which was held at the same time. That was in the village hall. But they later sort of amalgamated and became Stepping Stones. And I used to work at Stepping Stones, sort of doing a few shifts every week, which is really nice. Lots of people sort of came through the doors, and lots of people who worked there who we're still friendly with. There's Rosemary Deverell, Val Cowley, Lily Arthur, lots of people all sort of did their little stint at the playgroup, presumably when their own children were members there. While I was still working at Stepping Stones, Katie by that time was at the village school, and the headmaster, Lyle Haddon, he was aware that I was a nursery nurse. And the lady who was working at the school at the time as the teaching assistant was off sick. So he asked me if I would go and cover for her, supposedly for 6 weeks, but I ended up working at the school for 3 years. So again, lots of sort of happy memories of that time. I can always remember on one occasion, though, I'm not quite sure what she'd done, but Katie, my daughter, had obviously done something that she shouldn't have done, and she had to sit outside the headmaster's office to do her work. And every time I walked past her that day, I would glare at her and give her daggers. And she's never forgiven me for it to this day. She still talks about the time she was more terrified of me than being outside the headmaster's office, she always says. Going to school at the Friary on the school bus was always quite an experience, and could be quite sort of frightening at times, especially on dull days or if it was foggy or the weather was bad, because in those days there was no flyovers over the A38, and the bus used to have to pull into the centre reservation, and of course the back end of the bus would be sort of sticking over the fast lane of the carriageway, and there's been quite a few sort of near misses that I remember. And if ever it was a foggy day, I'd always make sure that I sat towards the front of the bus, that I wasn't putting myself in any danger. Quite scary times. Back in the 1980s, there used to be, I think it was the early 1980s, maybe late 70s, there used to be a carnival every year, which was organised by Maureen Hudson, who had a son with muscular dystrophy, and she used to raise money to support the condition. We used to do a sort of carnival parade, and we used to borrow lorries from Beryl Johnson, who had her yard in Furlong Lane, where Elaine Dolman lives now. And we'd decorate all the lorries up and sort of put on a procession, which always ended back at the Old British Legion on Wellfield Road, where there were lots of activities going on. We used to have tug of war competitions there. I can remember one year we put in a ladies' team from the William IV, and we proudly called ourselves the Willy Pullers. But there was always lots of activities, barbecues, all raising money for muscular dystrophy. And the local community used to get really involved. Some people would be sort of walking along with it on the parade. We've had sampans and bicycles, but on the lorries as well. Lots of fun. Always a good day. Also raising money for muscular dystrophy, the CB Radio Club used to organise pram races on Wartfield, which is always quite a spectacle to see. Lots of fun.